By the age of 30, he had conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen. He had marched his armies more than 11,000 miles, fought and won countless battles without a single defeat, and united the warring kingdoms of Greece, the mighty Persian Empire, and the exotic lands of Egypt and India under a single crown. He was worshipped as a god in his own lifetime, and his name became synonymous with greatness itself. His name was Alexander III of Macedon, but the world remembers him as Alexander the Great. He was a man of contradictions, a ruthless killer on the battlefield who wept for his enemies, a student of philosophy who could be savagely brutal, a king who believed in the unity of all peoples, yet demanded absolute submission to his will. He conquered the known world before he was old enough to have grey hair, and he died mysteriously at 32, leaving behind a legacy that would shape Western civilization for 2,000 years. This is the story of the boy who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. He was born in July 356 BC in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedon, a rough and mountainous kingdom north of the sophisticated Greek city-states. His father was Philip II, the brilliant and ambitious king who was transforming Macedon from a backwater into a military superpower. Philip was a warrior king, a man who had lost an eye in battle and built the finest army the world had ever seen, the legendary Macedonian phalanx, armed with 18-foot pikes called sarissas. His mother was Olympias, a princess from the wild kingdom of Epirus, a woman of fierce passions and mysterious religious rites. Olympias claimed descent from the legendary hero Achilles, and she told her son that his true father was not Philip at all, but Zeus, the king of the gods, who had visited her in the form of a serpent. This story may have been invented by Olympias to secure her son's position, or it may have been believed by Alexander himself. What is certain is that from his earliest childhood, Alexander was raised on a diet of heroic legend. He slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow, given to him by his tutor, and he dreamed of emulating his ancestor Achilles to win eternal glory through great deeds. When Alexander was 13, his father summoned the greatest philosopher in Greece to tutor the boy. Aristotle was already famous throughout the ancient world for his knowledge of science, ethics, politics, and literature. For 3 years, the philosopher taught the prince everything he knew: medicine, biology, geography, philosophy, and the art of governance. Aristotle gave Alexander a Greek education, but more importantly, he gave him a Greek worldview, the belief that Greek culture was superior and that non-Greeks, or barbarians, were naturally suited to be slaves. This lesson would shape Alexander's conquests and create tensions that would last his entire life. One of the most famous stories about young Alexander involves a horse. A horse trader brought a magnificent black stallion to King Philip, offering it for the enormous sum of 13 talents. But the horse was wild, rearing and bucking whenever anyone tried to mount him. Philip ordered the horse taken away. It was too vicious to be tamed. Young Alexander, watching the scene, cried out, "What a horse they are losing for want of skill and spirit to manage him!" Philip at first ignored the boy, but Alexander persisted. Finally, the king said, "Do you presume to blame your elders as if you knew more than they?" Alexander offered to tame the horse himself, and if he failed, he would pay the full price out of his own allowance. The court erupted in laughter, but Alexander walked calmly to the horse. He had noticed something the adults had missed. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. Alexander turned the animal's head toward the sun, so its shadow fell behind it. Then he spoke softly, stroking the horse's neck until it calmed. In one smooth motion, he vaulted onto its back and galloped away. Philip wept with joy. "O my son," he said, "seek thee out a kingdom worthy of thyself, for Macedon is too little for thee." Alexander named the horse Bucephalus, meaning ox head, because of the white mark on its flank shaped like a bull's head. For the next 20 years, Bucephalus would carry Alexander through every battle, from the Danube to the Indus, until the horse finally died of old age after the Battle of the Hydaspes in India. In 336 BC, King Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding by one of his own bodyguards. The reasons remain murky. Perhaps a personal grudge, perhaps a conspiracy involving his estranged wife Olympias, perhaps an agent of the Persian king. Whatever the cause, the throne of Macedon now belonged to Alexander, who was just 20 years old. The news of Philip's death spread like wildfire through the Greek world. The southern city-states, which Philip had conquered only after decades of war, saw their chance to break free. Thebes rose in rebellion. Athens wavered. The barbarian tribes to the north prepared to invade. Alexander moved with terrifying speed. He marched his armies south into Greece so quickly that the rebels were caught completely off guard. At Thebes, he demanded surrender. When the Thebans refused, he stormed the city, slaughtered 6,000 defenders, and sold the remaining 30,000 inhabitants into slavery. He razed the city to the ground, leaving only the house of the poet Pindar standing as a mark of respect for Greek culture. The message was clear: resist Alexander, and you will be erased from the earth. The other Greek cities quickly submitted. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander gathered his army at the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. He had approximately 37,000 men, Macedonian infantry, Greek allies, Thracian skirmishers, and Thessalian cavalry. He also had a vision: to avenge the Persian invasion of Greece 150 years earlier, and to surpass his ancestor Achilles in glory. Before crossing into Asia, Alexander visited the site of Troy, where the heroes of Homer's Iliad had fought. He ran naked around the tomb of Achilles, placing a wreath on the ancient hero's grave. His closest friend, Hephaestion, did the same at the tomb of Patroclus. Then Alexander crossed the Hellespont and threw a spear into Asian soil, claiming the entire continent as spear-won territory. The invasion of the Persian Empire had begun. The Persian Empire was the largest and wealthiest the world had ever known, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Its king, Darius III, commanded armies that could number in the hundreds of thousands. By comparison, Alexander's force of 37,000 seemed a mere raiding party. The first test came at the Granicus River in May 334 BC. The Persian satraps, provincial governors, had gathered an army of 40,000 men, including 20,000 Greek mercenaries, to block Alexander's advance. They lined the steep, muddy banks of the river, confident that the Macedonians could not cross against them. Alexander, against the advice of his general Parmenion, ordered an immediate attack. He led the charge himself, plunging into the river with his companion cavalry. The Persians hurled javelins from the high bank, and for a moment the Macedonians struggled in the mud. Alexander's plume made him a target, and a Persian nobleman struck him on the head with a battle-axe, splitting his helmet. As the man raised his arm for a second blow, Alexander's friend, Cleitus the Black, rode up and severed the Persian's arm with one stroke. The Macedonians fought their way onto the bank and drove the Persians from the field. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were surrounded and slaughtered. Most of them were killed, the survivors sent back to Macedon in chains. The victory at Granicus opened the door to Asia Minor. City after city surrendered to Alexander. When he reached Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, he was shown the legendary Gordian knot, a tangled mass of rope tied around a yoke with a prophecy that whoever could untie it would rule all of Asia. Alexander studied the knot for a moment. Then, according to the story, he simply drew his sword and sliced through it with one stroke. In 333 BC, Darius finally came himself. He gathered a massive army, estimates range from 100,000 to 600,000 men, and marched to meet Alexander near the town of Issus, on the modern border between Turkey and Syria. The terrain favored Alexander. The narrow coastal plain prevented the Persians from using their numerical advantage. Alexander led his companion cavalry in a charge straight at Darius himself. The Persian king, watching his elite guard being cut down around him, panicked and fled, abandoning his mother, his wife, and his daughters to Alexander's mercy. It was an act of shame by Persian standards. A king who abandons his family in battle has lost his honor. But Alexander treated the royal women with the utmost respect, assuring them that Darius remained their husband and father in his eyes. According to legend, when Darius's mother later mistook Alexander's friend Hephaestion for the king and bowed to him, Alexander simply said, "He too is Alexander." Darius fled east to regroup, leaving his treasury and his family in Alexander's hands. He sent envoys offering to cede all lands west of the Euphrates, pay a massive ransom for his family, and give Alexander his daughter in marriage. When Parmenion heard the offer, he reportedly said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander replied, "And so would I, if I were Parmenion." Alexander had no intention of stopping. He was not just fighting for territory, he was fighting for glory, for the dream of conquering the entire known world. He marched south along the Mediterranean coast, capturing the Phoenician cities one by one. Only Tyre resisted. The island city was surrounded by massive walls that rose sheer from the sea. Alexander had no navy, so he built one, a causeway half a mile long, constructed from stone and timber to connect the island to the mainland. For 7 months, the seas continued. Tyrian divers cut the causeway's anchor cables. Catapults hurled boulders at the Macedonian engineers. But Alexander was relentless. When the city finally fell, he took terrible revenge. He crucified 2,000 survivors along the seashore and sold 30,000 into slavery. It was a brutal lesson in the cost of defiance. From Tyre, Alexander marched south toward Egypt. The Persian satrap of Egypt wisely surrendered without a fight. The Egyptians, who had chafed under Persian rule for 2 centuries, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. They crowned him pharaoh and hailed him as the son of their god Ammon. Alexander traveled deep into the Libyan desert to visit the oracle of Ammon at Siwa. The priests, perhaps bribed, perhaps simply following Egyptian tradition, greeted him as the son of the god. When Alexander asked if he had punished all his father's murderers, the priest replied that he could not speak of his father in such terms. His father was not Philip, but Ammon. Alexander emerged from the temple convinced of his own divinity. From this point on, he began to demand that Greeks and Macedonians prostrate themselves before him in the Persian manner, an act of worship that horrified his Greek subjects, who reserved such honors only for the gods. In Egypt, Alexander did something no other conqueror had done. He founded a city. He personally marked out the boundaries of Alexandria, the first of many cities he would name after himself, on a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Moeotis. Within a century, Alexandria would become the greatest city of the ancient world, home to the famous library and a center of learning for 1,000 years. In 331 BC, Alexander marched east out of Egypt to meet Darius for the final time. The Persian king had assembled his last, greatest army, perhaps 200,000 men, including 200 scythed chariots and 15 war elephants, on the plain of Gaugamela, near the modern city of Mosul in Iraq. The night before the battle, Parmenion urged Alexander to attack under cover of darkness. Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory." He wanted the world to see that he could defeat the Persians in open battle, in broad daylight. On October 1st, 331 BC, the two armies faced each other across the dusty plain. Darius had smoothed the ground to help his chariots, but Alexander had prepared his men to open their ranks and let the chariots pass through, where they could be killed by the infantry. The battle began with Alexander leading his companion cavalry in a diagonal charge toward Darius's center. As the Persian cavalry moved to block him, a gap opened in their line. Alexander wheeled his horse and drove straight for the gap, his cavalry forming a wedge that pierced the Persian center. Once again, Darius fled, and once again, his army collapsed. Alexander pursued Darius for hundreds of miles, but the Persian king was finally killed by his own satraps. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, stabbed him and left him to die in a cart. Alexander found the body and, according to some accounts, wept. He draped his own cloak over Darius's corpse and sent it to Persepolis for a royal burial. With Darius dead, Alexander proclaimed himself the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. He was now king of Macedon, hegemon of Greece, pharaoh of Egypt, and great king of Persia, the master of the largest empire the world had ever seen. But conquering an empire was easier than ruling it. Alexander faced a dilemma. How could a small Macedonian elite govern millions of Persians? His solution was revolutionary and deeply unpopular with his own men. He began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian clothing, and appointing Persians to high positions in his administration. He encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women, setting an example by marrying Roxanne, a Bactrian princess himself. He staged a mass wedding at Susa, where 10,000 of his soldiers took Persian wives in a single ceremony. His Macedonian veterans were horrified. They saw themselves as conquerors, not partners. They resented seeing Persians in positions of authority. They muttered that their king had gone native, that he was becoming a tyrant, like the Persian despots they had been sent to destroy. The tension exploded in 328 BC at a drunken banquet in Samarkand. Clitus the Black, the same man who had saved Alexander's life at Granicus, had drunk too much wine and began to complain loudly that Alexander was forgetting his Macedonian friends in favor of Persian. He compared Alexander unfavorably to his father Philip. Alexander, also drunk, flew into a rage. He grabbed a spear from a guard and ran Clitus through. Almost immediately, he was overcome with grief. For 3 days he lay in his tent, refusing food or water, calling himself a murderer. It was the first crack in the legend, a sign that the strain of constant war and absolute power was taking its toll. By 327 BC, Alexander had conquered Persia, but the world was larger than he had imagined. Beyond Persia lay India, a land of wonders and mystery. Alexander gathered his army and marched east. The Indian kings, called Rajahs, were fierce warriors who fought with huge war elephants. At the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced his last great battle against King Porus, a giant of a man who towered over his soldiers. The river was swollen with monsoon rains, and Porus's army, including 200 elephants, waited on the opposite bank. Alexander crossed the river under cover of darkness, using a fierce thunderstorm to mask his movements. The battle that followed was the hardest of his career. The Macedonian horses, terrified of the elephants, refused to approach them. For hours the fighting was savage. But Alexander's tactics prevailed, and Porus was finally captured. When the wounded Indian king was brought before him, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. "Like a king," Porus replied. Alexander, impressed by his courage, not only spared him, but gave him back his kingdom and added new territories to it. But the victory came at a cost. Alexander's army had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured years of hardship. When Alexander announced that they would continue east toward the Ganges River, the men finally refused. For 3 days, Alexander sulked in his tent, hoping his men would change their minds. They did not. Finally, Coenus, one of his most trusted generals, spoke for the army. "You see that you have with you men who have shared your labors, but you do not see that they are weary in body and spirit." Alexander emerged from his tent and announced that they would turn back. His men cheered, but Alexander was crushed. According to one story, he wept, not from sorrow, but because there were no more worlds to conquer. The return journey was a nightmare. Alexander led his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a barren wasteland in modern Pakistan and Iran. Thousands died of thirst and heat stroke. The army was reduced to eating its own pack animals. Women and children who had followed the camp were left to die in the sand. By the time Alexander reached Susa in 324 BC, his empire stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. He had founded more than 70 cities, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, and created a new class of Greco-Persian aristocrats who would rule his empire for generations. But his health was failing. The constant campaigning had left him scarred and weakened. He had been wounded countless times: an arrow in the lung at Gaza, a stone on the head at Seropolis, an arrow in the leg at the Hydaspes, a fractured ankle in Central Asia. In Babylon, he began planning new campaigns to Arabia, to Carthage, to the Western Mediterranean. But he never launched them. In early June 323 BC, Alexander attended a party thrown by his friend Medius. He drank heavily through the night, then fell suddenly ill with a fever. The fever worsened over the next 10 days. On June 10th, he was unable to speak or move. His soldiers, desperate to see their king one last time, filed past his bed in silence. Alexander could not speak, but he raised his head slightly and moved his eyes, acknowledging each man. When his generals asked to whom he left his empire, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." On June 11th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon at the age of 32. He had reigned for 12 years and 8 months. The cause of his death remains a mystery. Some historians suggest typhoid fever, others malaria, others poisoning. The ancient sources mention that when his body was prepared for burial, it showed no signs of decay for 6 days, a phenomenon that convinced many that he truly was a god. When news of Alexander's death reached Greece, the Athenian orator Demosthenes reportedly danced with joy. But the world Alexander had created could not be undone. His empire was immediately torn apart by his generals, the Diadochi, the successors, who fought for 40 years over the pieces. But Alexander's true legacy was not his empire. It was the Hellenistic world he created, a fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures that would shape civilization for 1,000 years. Greek became the language of commerce and government from Egypt to India. Greek art, philosophy, and science spread across Asia. The great cities he founded, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Kandahar in Afghanistan, became centers of learning and culture. When the Romans later conquered the Greek world, they absorbed this Hellenistic culture and spread it across Europe. And the legend of Alexander himself grew. In Persia, he was remembered as the accursed for destroying the Achaemenid Empire. In medieval Europe, he was a hero of romance, a chivalrous knight centuries before chivalry existed. In the Quran, he appears as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a righteous conqueror who builds a wall to protect the world from Gog and Magog. Napoleon studied his campaigns. Every conqueror since has measured himself against Alexander. He was the first European to see the Himalayas, the first to dream of a united world. He conquered everything from Greece to India before he was old enough to have a beard. And when he died, he left a legacy that would shape the world for 2,000 years. Alexander the Great, the boy who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer.